The first shout cut through the dust-heavy air like a cracked whip, sharp enough to make every head in the street turn. She stood there alone, hands bound in front of her, boots planted in the dirt as if the ground itself was the only thing still willing to hold her up. The sun was sinking low behind the false front buildings, painting the town in copper and blood-red light, and yet no one stepped forward to stand beside her. Not one voice rose in her defense. In a town that prided itself on justice, she had already been judged. They said she brought ruin with her. They said trouble followed her like a shadow at noon. Some whispered she was cursed. Others claimed she had bewitched men into doing terrible things. The truth, whatever it was, did not seem to matter anymore. What mattered was that the town needed someone to blame, and she had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The wooden steps of the saloon creaked behind her as men leaned forward to watch, boots thudding, spurs clinking, eyes hard and hungry for a spectacle. The marshal cleared his throat and read the charges again, his voice dry and flat, as if he were listing supplies instead of deciding a fate. Theft, deceit, the death of a man whose name still made the town uneasy. Each word landed heavier than the last. She lifted her chin, refusing to bow her head, though fear burned behind her eyes. She had learned long ago that weakness invited cruelty. Still her heart pounded so loud she was sure they could hear it. Around her, the town of Red Hollow held its breath. This was an old American frontier place, carved out of dust and stubbornness, where law was thin and mercy thinner. Men here believed survival was proof of righteousness. Women learned to keep quiet or be broken. Outsiders were watched, judged, and if necessary, erased. She was not born here, and they never let her forget it. She searched the crowd one last time, hoping for a familiar face. Someone who knew the truth. Someone who owed her a favor or remembered a kindness. But eyes slid away. His mouth stayed shut. Even the preacher looked at the ground. The silence felt louder than the accusations. The saloon doors stood open behind her, spilling the smell of whiskey and sweat into the street. Inside, the long bar gleamed dull and scarred, just like the men who leaned against it. Cards lay forgotten on tables. A piano player sat frozen, fingers hovering above the keys. This was the heart of the town, where deals were made, secrets traded, and reputations destroyed. If she was to fall, it would be here, in front of everyone. She thought of the long road that had brought her west, promises whispered under open skies, a believing that a new land meant a new beginning. Instead, it had given her a trial she'd never asked for and a crowd eager to see her lose. Her wrists ached against the rope, but she did not cry out. She would not give them that satisfaction. The marshal asked if anyone would speak on her behalf. His words echoed off the buildings and drifted away unanswered. A child somewhere began to cry, then was quickly hushed. A buzz of murmurs rose, low and restless, like flies circling a wound. The verdict felt close enough to touch. That was when the wind changed. At first it was just a hush, a strange pause that rippled through the crowd. Then came the sound of hooves, slow and steady, approaching from the edge of town. Heads turned again, this time with confusion. Red Hollow was not used to late arrivals, especially not ones who rode in with such calm purpose. The horse stepped into view, dark-coated and powerful, its rider sitting tall and unmoving. He did not look like the men of Red Hollow. His presence carried the weight of old land and older battles. Long hair fell over his shoulders, tied with leather, moving gently with the horse's stride. His eyes were sharp, taking in every detail without haste. There was no rush in him, no fear. Were the marks of the Apache, proud and unhidden, as if daring anyone to challenge his right to stand there. A murmur spread thicker now. Some stepped back. Others stiffened. Old stories whispered themselves into the air, tales of raids and blood, of wars the town preferred to forget. Red Hollow had learned to fear the Apache, even as it pretended to have tamed the land they belonged to. The rider dismounted near the saloon, boots hitting the ground with quiet certainty. He tied his horse as if this were any other stop on a long journey, then turned toward the crowd. His gaze went first to the marshal, then to the men on the steps, and finally to her. For a moment, the world narrowed to that look. She felt it like a hand closing around her spine, not cruel, not gentle, but unbreakable. She did not know him. She was sure of that. And yet something in his eyes told her he knew exactly who she was, knew more than the town ever had. The marshal straightened, trying to reclaim control. He demanded the stranger state his business. The Apache man took a step forward, slow enough to be deliberate, close enough that the tension snapped tight. The crowd parted without realizing it, giving him space as if instinct alone commanded it. His voice when he spoke was low and steady, carrying across the street without effort. He did not shout, did not threaten. He simply stated a truth that landed like thunder. "She is my wife." The words cut through Red Hollow and left it stunned. Gasps broke out. Laughter followed, sharp and disbelieving. Someone swore under their breath. The marshal frowned, uncertain, while the men on the saloon steps shifted uneasily. An Apache, claiming a woman on trial in front of the whole town, was not part of any rulebook they knew. Her breath caught in her chest. Wife. The word felt unreal, dangerous, and somehow protective all at once. She turned her head slowly to look at him, searching his face for mockery or madness. She found neither, only resolve. The marshal demanded proof. The town demanded answers. The Apache man did not flinch. He stepped closer to her now, close enough that she could smell leather and dust, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. He did not touch her, but he stood as if he already belonged at her side. Old laws stirred, half-forgotten agreements between armies and tribes, rules written in ink and blood. Marriage meant protection. Marriage meant jurisdiction. Marriage meant the town could not move as easily as it wanted to anymore. The crowd began to argue among itself, voices rising, fear mixing with anger. Some wanted the trial finished before nightfall. Others wanted the Apache gone. No one seemed ready for what this moment meant. She swallowed, heart racing, mind spinning with questions she could not ask out loud. Who is this man? Why would he claim her? What price would such a claim demand? As the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the street, Red Hollow stood on the edge of something it could not undo. And she, once alone, now stood at the center of a storm that had only just begun. The street did not move after his words. It was as if time itself hesitated, unsure of which way to fall. The marshal's hand hovered near his belt, not drawing, not retreating. Men exchanged looks that carried more fear than anger now. Old laws were dangerous things. Once spoken, they demanded respect, even from those who hated them. The Apache stood firm beside her, his posture calm, almost protective without touching her. He did not repeat himself, did not explain. Silence forced the town to speak instead, and Red Hollow was never good at that. Voices rose, overlapping, arguing over rules none of them had bothered to remember until now. Someone claimed it was a trick. Someone else said it did not matter who she belonged to. Another warned that crossing tribal law had consequences no jail could hold. She listened, barely hearing any of it. Her world had narrowed again, this time to the man standing near her shoulder. She studied him from the corner of her eye. The scars on his hands were old, earned, not careless. His clothes were worn but kept with intention. This was not a man drifting through towns on chance. This was someone who walked with purpose, someone who chose his steps carefully. The marshal finally found his voice. He demanded the Apache give his name and his claim. The Apache answered slowly, his name spoken like a marker driven into the ground. It was a name that carried weight, a name known beyond Red Hollow, whispered along trade routes and campfires. Some of the older men stiffened at the sound of it. They had heard stories. Not all of them ended well. The claim, however, remained simple. He said he had taken her as his wife under the open sky with witnesses who did not wear badges or drink whiskey. He said the bond was real, older than the town, older than its rules. The law, thin as it was, had no easy way to cut through that. The crowd pressed closer, curiosity wrestling with fear. She felt their eyes on her again, searching her face for signs of guilt or deceit. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She wanted to speak, to deny or confirm, but her voice felt trapped, somewhere deep inside her chest. She did not yet know which truth would save her or destroy her faster. As the argument stretched on, the past began to creep in, uninvited. She remembered the day she first arrived in Red Hollow, dust clinging to her skirts, hope heavier than her bags. The town had seemed rough, but promising, a place where hard work might earn peace. She had found work, kept her head down, and learn the rhythms of frontier life. Still, she never fully belonged. Whispers followed her. Questions lingered too long. The man whose death now hung over her like a shadow had been part of that slow, tightening circle. He had smiled too much, promised help, offered protection that felt more like a trap. When he died, the town did not look for answers. It looked for her. The Apache's arrival tore open all those old doubts. Some wondered if she had always been tied to him, if she had been an agent of something they feared. Others wondered if the Apache had come to claim more than just a woman, land maybe, or revenge. Red Hollow had taken much from people like him and given little back. The saloon owner leaned out from the doorway, his voice loud and uncertain, reminding everyone that trouble drove business away. No one listened. Trouble was already here, standing in the street with quiet eyes and a claim that refused to be ignored. The marshal ordered her taken inside the saloon for the moment, not to a cell, not yet. The Apache did not object, but he moved with her, matching her step for step. That alone sent another ripple of unease through the crowd. Inside, the air was thick, the light dimmer. Shadows clung to the walls, stretching long across the floor. She was guided to a chair near the center of the room. The rope around her wrists was loosened, but not removed. The Apache remained standing, a solid presence beside her, his gaze never leaving the marshal. The piano player quietly slipped away. Cards were gathered. Conversations died mid-sentence. The marshal asked questions again, slower this time. Where had they met? When? Who had witnessed this union? The Apache answered some, and left others untouched, not out of defiance, but out of choice. He spoke of a crossing near a river far from Red Hollow, of a moment when paths had intersected under threat from men worse than this town. His words painted a picture without filling in its edges. She listened, stunned by fragments that felt strangely familiar. A river, a night of fear. A rider appearing when hope had thinned. Memories stirred, blurred by exhaustion and time, but present enough to make her breath catch. She glanced at him again, and this time his eyes flicked briefly to hers.
Ow.
There was no question in them, only recognition. Outside, dusk settled fully, pressing against the windows. Lanterns were lit, their glow casting uneasy shapes on the walls. The crowd had not dispersed. They waited, hungry for an outcome, any outcome. The marshal called for patience, for time to consider. He did not say what would happen if the Apache's claim was rejected, or if it was accepted. No one asked. Some futures were better left unnamed. As the room grew quieter, she felt the weight of everything unsaid, pressing down on her. If this man was lying, he risked war for a stranger. If he spoke the truth, then her life had been tied to his long before this trial ever began. Either way, the town would not forget this night. The Apache finally spoke again, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. He said Red Hollow was standing at a crossroads, whether it knew it or not. Said choices made in fear had a way of coming back dressed as consequences. He said he would not leave without her. Those words settled deep, heavy with promise and threat. The marshal rubbed his jaw, eyes darting to the windows, to the crowd, to the woman seated before him. The law had never felt so small. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled far off, a warning without rain. Inside the saloon, alliances shifted quietly, like cards being reshuffled under the table. Said, caught between a town that wanted her gone and a man whose claim changed everything. Knowing that whatever truth lay between them had not yet been fully spoken, night settled over Red Hollow like a held breath. The lanterns outside the saloon burned low, their light flickering across tense faces that refused to leave. Inside, the air felt heavier with every passing minute. The marshal had not announced a verdict, but the town was already choosing sides. Some leaned toward fear, others toward anger, and a few toward opportunity. Trouble always brought chances for men who knew how to use it. The Apache stood unmoved, his presence steady as stone. His name traveled quietly through the room now, spoken in hushed tones. Older settlers remembered stories told around dying fires, stories of a warrior who did not waste words and never broke his own laws. Younger men only felt the unease, the sense that this was not a fight they could win with fists or threats. She sat still, hands resting in her lap, rope slack but still there, a reminder that freedom had not yet returned to her. Her thoughts drifted back again, this time clearer. The river crossing, the chaos, men shouting, a wagon wheel breaking loose. She remembered fear so sharp it had robbed her of breath. And then a figure on horseback, cutting through the confusion, eyes locked on hers with purpose. At the time, she had believed it was the mind's last trick before despair. Now, with him standing beside her, the memory felt painfully real. Across the room, a man named Calderon watched her closely. He had been the first to accuse her after the death, the loudest voice demanding punishment. Calderon had built his influence on knowing everyone's secrets and using them well. This situation unsettled him. If the Apache's claim held, Calderon's careful web would tear. He did not like things he could not control. Calderon leaned toward another man, whispering. Eyes shifted. A plan began to form, not spoken aloud but understood. If the town could not break the Apache's claim directly, it could pressure the woman. Fear had always been an effective tool. The marshal called for quiet again, his patience thinning. He ordered a guard posted at the door, not to keep the Apache in, but to keep the crowd from storming out of control. Red Hollow balanced on the edge of violence, and everyone knew it.
Ow.
One wrong word could turn this trial into something bloodier. Outside, a group of riders arrived, dust rising under their horses' hooves. They did not dismount right away. They watched. The Apache noticed them instantly. His shoulders tensed, just enough to signal readiness. These were not townsfolk. Their clothes and posture marked them as men who made their living in conflict. Their arrival added another layer to the growing knot of danger. Inside the saloon, the preacher finally spoke, voice trembling but sincere. He urged caution, reminded the town of mercy and restraint. His words floated weakly, barely touching the hardened resolve in the room. Mercy was a luxury few believed they could afford. She felt a quiet resolve grow inside her, something steadier than fear. If she had learned anything in the West, it was that silence could be mistaken for surrender. She lifted her head and spoke, her voice clear, despite the strain. She did not confess. She did not accuse. She told them she would stand for the truth, whatever it was, and that she would not be broken by lies. That surprised them more than the Apache's claim. Calderon scoffed, but others shifted uncomfortably. Strength in a woman, unsettled, Red Hollow. It forced questions they did not want to answer. The marshal studied her longer this time, as if seeing her for the first time instead of the story built around her. The Apache turned slightly toward her, acknowledgement passing between them without words. Whatever bond existed or did not exist, they now shared a common enemy in the shape of the town's hunger for blame. One of the riders outside finally dismounted. His boots hit the dirt with deliberate weight, pushed through the saloon doors without waiting for permission. His name carried its own reputation, one tied to hired violence and silent jobs. He tipped his hat just enough to be polite and announced that certain people beyond Red Hollow had taken an interest in the outcome of this trial. That changed everything. Suddenly, this was no longer just about a woman accused or an Apache making a claim. It was about territory, influence, and the fragile order of the frontier. Red Hollow was a small place, but small places often sat on valuable ground. The marshal demanded to know who had sent him. The rider smiled without warmth and said names that tightened jaws across the room. Names tied to rail lines, land deeds, and promises of progress that always came soaked in blood. The Apache listened carefully, eyes darkening. He knew these forces well. They had pushed his people from riverbanks and hunting grounds, calling it law. This trial, he realized, was only a piece of something larger. The woman was a convenient spark. She felt the shift too. The room no longer looked at her as just a suspect. She was a leverage point, a symbol. It frightened her more than any rope ever had. The writer suggested a compromise, one that sounded reasonable on the surface. Delay the verdict. Hold her under watch. Let higher authority decide. It was a cage disguised as patience. The Apache rejected it calmly, said she would not be taken anywhere without him. Tension snapped tight again. Hands drifted closer to weapons. The guard at the door swallowed hard. The saloon owner backed away, already regretting the night. Outside, thunder rolled closer, the air thick with the promise of a storm. She felt the weight of choice pressing down on her. Whatever happened next would set events in motion that could not be undone. She glanced at the Apache once more, searching his face for certainty. She found resolve, but also warning. This path would not be easy. It would cost something, maybe everything. The marshal raised his hand, demanding order one last time. He said the night was not finished with them yet. And as lightning flashed beyond the windows, casting sharp shadows across the room, it became clear that Red Hollow was no longer in control of its own story. The storm finally broke. Rain striking the roof of the saloon in heavy sheets, drumming like a warning meant for every soul inside. Wind pushed through the cracks, rattling shutters and nerves alike. Red Hollow felt smaller now, boxed in by darkness, weather, and the choices it had been avoiding for years. No one moved to leave. Whatever was coming would happen here. The marshal lowered his hands slowly, his authority hanging by a thread. He ordered the guards doubled and the doors barred, not as an act of power, but protection. Outsiders, hired men, and old grudges had collided, and he knew how quickly that turned deadly. He glanced at the Apache, then at the woman, weighing the cost of each path before him. The Apache remained calm, but the stillness around him sharpened. He listened to the rain, to the shifting boots, to the breathing of men who had already decided more than they admitted. He had walked into danger before, but this was different. This was not a battlefield. This was a test of whether the old ways and new lies could coexist even for one night. She felt the tension coil tight inside her chest. The saloon seemed to tilt as if the whole building leaned toward a single breaking point. She thought of the road again, of all the moments that had led her here. If she survived this, there would be no returning to who she had been. Survival would demand change. Calderon made his move quietly. He slipped toward the back, whispering to one of the guards he had known for years. Coins changed hands unseen. Fear and greed worked faster than truth ever could. Calderon believed if the Apache was removed from the board, the rest would fall into place. Red Hollow always bent to men like him, always had. The Apache noticed the shift before anyone else. His eyes tracked the guard's nervous glance, the subtle reach beneath the coat. He placed himself just a step closer to the woman, not shielding her fully, but making a promise clear. If violence came, it would come through him first. The rider who had arrived earlier leaned against the bar, watching with interest rather than concern. The chaos was useful to men like him. The longer this stretched, the more leverage he gained. He spoke again, casually suggesting that tempers were rising and accidents happened in storms. His smile never reached his eyes. The marshal slammed his hand on the table, finally anger cutting through his doubt. He warned that any blood spilled here would bring consequences from beyond Red Hollow. Railmen, soldiers, courts that did not care about frontier excuses. For a moment, the threat of outside order chilled the room. That was when the woman stood. The scrape of her chair against the floor sliced through the noise, sharper than a gunshot. Every head turned. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She told them she would not run, would not hide, and would not be traded like land or cattle. She said the truth would come out whether they liked it or not. She said she was done being afraid of men who needed her silent to feel strong. Something shifted then, not in everyone, but enough. The Apache looked at her with something like pride, though his face remained controlled. He spoke next, his voice steady, carrying across the room despite the rain. He said this town had mistaken patience for weakness. He said he had walked a long way not to start a fight, but to finish one that had begun long ago. His words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact. Calderon stepped forward, unable to hold back anymore. He accused the Apache of manipulation, of stirring unrest, of hiding behind old laws to steal a woman from justice. His voice shook, not with righteousness, but fear of losing control. He pointed at her and called her the cause of all this trouble. The woman met his gaze without blinking. For the first time, others noticed how his story did not quite fit. How often he spoke for the dead man, how quickly he redirected blame. Doubt crept in, quiet but dangerous. Thunder cracked close enough to shake dust from the beams. One of the guards reached for his weapon. Another stopped him. Single bad decision hung in the air, waiting for someone to make it. The marshal ordered everyone to stand down. He declared the trial paused until morning light, when tempers cooled and facts could be weighed properly. It was not justice yet, but it was time. Time was precious now. The rider objected, but his words fell flat. Too many eyes were on him. Too many questions had surfaced. Even hired men knew when to wait. The Apache nodded once, accepting the pause without surrender. He told the marshal he would remain in town until the truth was settled. He said the woman would stay under his watch, not the town's ropes. The marshal hesitated, then agreed, knowing refusal might spark exactly what he feared. As arrangements were made, whispers spread through Red Hollow like sparks on dry grass. Some spoke of old wrongs coming due. Others wondered if they had judged too quickly. The storm outside began to ease, rain softening, thunder moving farther away. She stood beside the Apache now, unbound, though not yet free. Her heart still raced, but beneath it was something new. Hope, fragile but real. Whatever lay ahead would be hard, but she would not face it alone. Calderon watched them from the shadows, his jaw tight, mind already turning toward his next move. Men like him did not accept loss easily. Somewhere in the dark, plans were forming that would test every promise made tonight. As the saloon slowly emptied and the night deepened, Red Hollow held on to a fragile calm. The most dangerous moment was still coming, and everyone could feel it. The storm had passed, but the ground beneath them was already shifting, setting the stage for a reckoning that would decide who this town truly belonged to. Morning came to Red Hollow quietly, as if the land itself was tired of conflict. The rain had washed the dust from the streets, leaving the ground dark and clean, almost new. Sunlight slipped through the clouds and touched the town with a softness it had not felt in a long time. People stepped out of their homes slower than usual, carrying curiosity and unease in equal measure. Everyone knew this day would decide more than one life. The saloon doors opened again, and the same room that had held fear now held tension sharpened by daylight. The marshal stood straighter, steadied by rest and the presence of witnesses who had arrived overnight. Traders, travelers, and a judge passing through on official business had all been delayed by the storm. Their arrival changed the balance. Red Hollow was no longer alone with its choices. She stood beside the Apache. No rope around her wrists this time. Her shoulders were squared, her gaze steady. The night had taken something from her, but it had given something back as well, clarity. She knew now that silence had nearly destroyed her, and truth was the only path left. Calderon arrived last. His confidence from the night before had thinned. In daylight, secrets had a way of showing their shape. Whispers followed him as he entered. Men who once nodded at him now watched with caution. Power based on fear rarely survived scrutiny. The marshal called the gathering to order and invited the witnesses forward. One by one, pieces of the past fell into place. A trader spoke of seeing the dead man arguing violently days before his death. Not with her, but with Calderon over land rights near the river. A stable hand admitted he had been paid to stay silent about a fight that ended badly. A ledger was produced showing debts and threats that painted a clearer picture. Calderon tried to interrupt, his voice rising, but it lacked its old force. When questioned directly, his answers twisted, then broke. The truth did not need to be dramatic. It only needed light. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When the story had been fully told, he delivered his ruling without flourish. The charges against the woman were dismissed. The blame, once so easily placed, shifted where it belonged. Calderon's face drained of color as the weight of his actions finally settled on him. Guards stepped forward, this time without hesitation. A quiet murmur rolled through the room. Not anger, not celebration, but something close to relief. Red Hollow had nearly destroyed an innocent life to protect a lie. The realization stung. She exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for months. Her knees weakened slightly, and before she could steady herself, the Apache was there, offering support without making a show of it. The gesture was simple, respectful, and it meant more to her than any loud defense ever could. The judge turned his attention to the Apache's claim. Old laws were reviewed, agreements acknowledged. The bond he spoke of was recognized, not as a trick, but as a valid union, under protections older than Red Hollow itself. There was no outrage this time, only acceptance, slow but sincere. Outside, the town gathered as the news spread. Some felt shame. Others felt gratitude that blood had been avoided. Change did not come easily, but it had come. Later, when the saloon had emptied and the town returned to its routines, she walked the street beside the Apache. The sun was higher now, warming the boards beneath their feet. For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, she felt seen rather than judged. They spoke then, truly spoke, filling in the spaces between memory and truth. He told her how he had searched after that night by the river, how fate and patience had guided him back to her when the world tried to break her. She told him of her loneliness, her struggle to survive in a place that demanded silence. Each word stitched something stronger between them. Red Hollow watched from a distance, uncertain but curious. Children stared openly. Older folk nodded with reserved respect. The town had learned something it could not unlearn. Strength did not always look like control. Sometimes it looked like standing alone until someone chose to stand with you. In the days that followed, Calderon was taken away to face consequences beyond Red Hollow. His influence faded quickly, leaving space for fairness to take root. The marshal changed too, carrying the weight of nearly making a terrible mistake, determined not to repeat it. She chose to stay, not out of defiance, but purpose. With the Apache at her side, she found a place in the town that had once rejected her. Together, they built a life that blended old traditions with new beginnings. A home near the edge of town became a bridge rather than a boundary. Red Hollow slowly became known for something other than fear. Travelers spoke of a place where justice had learned to listen, where a woman had stood trial alone until an Apache walked into a saloon and changed everything. On quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low and the wind carried the smell of clean earth, she would sit beside him and think of how close she had come to losing it all. The lesson stayed with her. Truth might walk a lonely road, but it was never meant to walk it forever. And in that frontier town, under wide American skies, two lives once pulled apart by fear found their way forward together, leaving behind a story of courage, love, and a justice hard-earned but finally kept.